The Likens couple had an unstable marriage. They often traveled around Indiana selling candy, beer, and soda at carnival stands throughout the summer, frequently relocating and consistently facing severe financial challenges. The Likens sons regularly traveled with them to help with their work, but Sylvia and Jenny were discouraged from joining, mainly out of concern for their safety and education. As a result, the sisters often stayed with relatives, usually their grandmother. By June 1965, Sylvia and Jenny were living with their parents in Indianapolis. On July 3rd, their mother was arrested and subsequently jailed for shoplifting. Shortly after, Lester Likens arranged for his daughters to stay with Gertrude Banaszewski, a mother of two girls, Paula and Stephanie, whom the sisters had recently met at Arsenal Technical High School. When making this arrangement, Gertrude assured Lester that she would take care of his daughters as if they were her own children, but the reality would prove tragically different. Sylvia Marie Likens was born on January 3, 1949, in Lebanon, Indiana, USA. She was the third of 5 children born to carnival workers Lester Likens and his wife, Betty Likens, formerly Grimes when she was single. Sylvia grew up between 2 sets of twins, Daniel and Diana, who were 2 years older, and Benny and Jenny, who were a year younger. Her little sister Jenny had polio, which weakened one of her legs significantly, causing her to limp noticeably. She had to wear a steel brace on her leg to help her walk. Her parents, Lester and Betty, had a rocky marriage. They often sold candy, beer, and soft drinks at carnival booths throughout Indiana all summer long, constantly moving and frequently facing serious financial difficulties. The Likens children sometimes traveled with them to help out, but Sylvia and Jenny often stayed with relatives, mostly with their grandmother. This arrangement not only kept the young girls safe, but also allowed them to continue their education more steadily. From a young age, Sylvia took on babysitting and did errands for neighbors and friends. She also did household chores like ironing clothes, earning a little bit of money to buy things for herself. She often shared her earnings with her mom. Those who knew her said Sylvia was a friendly, confident, and charming girl. She had long, wavy, light brown hair that fell just below her shoulders. Her friends called her Cookie. Despite her vibrant personality, Sylvia was self-conscious about her smile because she was missing a front tooth, which she lost while playing with one of her brothers as a child. She loved music, especially the Beatles, and was very protective of her younger sister Jenny. Jenny was much shyer and less secure. The sisters often visited a local skating rink where Sylvia would help Jenny skate, holding her hand as Jenny relied heavily on her stronger leg. In June 1965, Sylvia and Jenny Likens were living with their parents in Indianapolis. The following month, their mother was arrested and later jailed for theft. Shortly thereafter, Lester arranged for his younger daughters to stay with Gertrude Banaszewski, a mother of 2 girls, Paula and Stephanie, whom the Likens sisters had met at Arsenal Technical High School. Gertrude assured Lester that she would look after the girls as if they were her own until his return. A little after the 4th of July celebrations, the Likens sisters moved to 3850 East New York Street, while their father, older brothers, and later their mother went to the East Coast with the carnival. The deal with Gertrude was that she would receive $20 a week in exchange for hosting Sylvia and Jenny and taking care of them until they returned in November. Initially, everything at the Banaszewski home seemed normal. Sylvia got along well with Stephanie, singing along to pop records and willingly helping with household chores. The Lykin sisters regularly attended Sunday school with the other Banishevsky children, and the pastor praised Sylvia's kindness and respect for sacred matters. Although Lester had agreed to pay Gertrude, the payment started to arrive late, usually a day or two beyond the scheduled dates. However, this delay soon began to irritate Gertrude. Out of frustration, she started mistreating the girls, beginning with spanking them on their bare buttocks with various instruments, such as a 1/4-inch thick paddle, making statements such as, "Well, I took care of you two little bitches for a week for nothing." As the payment delays became more frequent, the beatings and mistreatment escalated. On one occasion, both girls were hit about 15 times on the back with the paddle after Paula accused them of eating too much at a church dinner they had attended with the other children. It had only been a month since they had been staying with the Banishevsky family, and it was now the end of August. By that time, Gertrude had begun to focus all her frustration and abuse almost exclusively on Sylvia. Some speculated that jealousy might have been the driving factor, as Sylvia was not only beautiful, but also had her whole life ahead of her. As the days went by, the abuse and mistreatment escalated. In addition to more frequent beatings, the sisters, particularly Sylvia, were starved. Often they were only given leftovers or spoiled food from the trash cans. On one occasion, Sylvia was accused of stealing candies, though she had actually bought them. Another time, she was publicly humiliated. Sylvia claimed she had a boyfriend in Long Beach, whom she had met in the spring when her family lived in California. As she shared stories about those days with Stephanie and Jenny, Sylvia mentioned that once she had snuggled under the covers with her boyfriend. Hearing this, Gertrude asked, "Why did you do that, Sylvia?" Sylvia shrugged and replied, "I don't know," and shrugged. A few days later, Gertrude brought up the topic again, suggesting mockingly, "Your stomach seems to be getting bigger, Sylvia. Looks like you might be having a baby." Sylvia thought it was a joke and responded, "Yeah, it must be getting big then." The abuse escalated. Gertrude repeatedly brought up Sylvia's interactions with boys, insinuating that any contact would surely lead to pregnancy. Suddenly, one day she kicked Sylvia in the genitals. Paula, one of Gertrude's daughters who was overweight, 3 months pregnant, and jealous of Sylvia's looks, joined in the attack. She pulled Sylvia from her chair to the kitchen floor and yelled, "You're not fit to sit in a chair." On another occasion, while the family was having dinner, Gertrude, Paula, and a neighborhood boy named Randy Gordon Lepper forced Sylvia to eat a hot dog overloaded with mustard, ketchup, and other spices. Naturally, Sylvia vomited, and they cruelly made her swallow what she had thrown up. Exhausted from all the abuse, Sylvia apparently spread a rumor at school accusing Stephanie and Paula of prostitution. One day, a boy made propositions to Stephanie at school, mentioning Sylvia had started the rumor. When they got home from school, Stephanie confronted Sylvia, who admitted to starting the rumor. In retaliation, Stephanie punched Sylvia hard. Sylvia, crying, apologized, and Stephanie also started crying. Randolph Hubbard, 15, Stephanie's boyfriend, learned about the incident and the rumors and brutally attacked Sylvia. He slapped her, slammed her head against the wall, and then threw her down on the floor. Gertrude also joined in, repeatedly using the paddle to beat Sylvia. Every day at the Banishevsky residence was a nightmare, with the episodes of violence only worsening. On one occasion, Paula punched Sylvia in the face with such force that she fractured her own wrist, focusing all her blows on Sylvia's mouth and eyes. Later, Paula used the cast on her arm to hit Sylvia even harder. But the violence wasn't just physical. The Lykin sisters were also subjected to verbal and psychological abuse. On one occasion, Gertrude accused Sylvia of being promiscuous and engaging in prostitution. She delivered a lengthy tirade about the filth of prostitution and the degradation of women in general. Afterwards, she forced young Jenny to hit her own older sister, threatening that if she didn't comply, she would suffer the same fate as Sylvia. The assaults on the Likens girls didn't only come from the Banaszewski family. Coy Hubbard and several of his classmates frequently visited Gertrude's home and tormented Sylvia both physically and verbally. Often Gertrude's own children, and even Gertrude herself, would join in to inflict harm on Sylvia. The neighborhood children routinely beat Sylvia. Sometimes they used her as a practice dummy in violent judo sessions, sawing her body, burning her skin with burning sticks. They went so far as to severely injure little Sylvia's genitals. To entertain Gertrude and her teenage accomplices, Sylvia was forced to undress in the living room and masturbate with a bottle. Afterwards, Gertrude would tell everyone that this act of humiliation was to show Jenny what kind of girl her sister was. Over time, Gertrude banned Sylvia from attending school after she confessed to stealing a gym suit from school. She had only taken it because Gertrude refused to buy her clothes. This not only disrupted her education but also led to severe punishment. Gertrude repeatedly beat Sylvia with a 7-centimeter wide police belt. Gertrude shifted the conversation to the evils of premarital sex and then brutally kicked Likens in the genitals. During this attack, Stephanie came to Likens' defense, shouting, "She didn't do anything." Gertrude continued her torment by burning Likens' fingertips with matches before further whipping her. A few days later, Gertrude again used the police belt to repeatedly whip Jenny after she reportedly stole a single tennis shoe from school to wear on her stronger foot. Due to the increasing frequency and brutality of the torture and mistreatment, Sylvia gradually became incontinent. She was denied access to the bathroom and was forced to wet herself as a form of punishment for her incontinence. On October 6, 1965, Gertrude threw Sylvia Likens into the basement and tied her up. She often kept Sylvia naked, barely fed her, and frequently denied her water. Sylvia was almost always tied to the stair railing in the basement, with her feet barely touching the ground. The Banaszewski family occasionally paused their physical and mental torment to watch their favorite TV shows. They even involved neighborhood boys who paid 5 cents each to see Sylvia's body displayed and to participate in humiliating her, beating her, burning her, and ultimately mutilating her. During her captivity in the basement, Gertrude and her children tied and gagged Sylvia, then placed her in a bathtub filled with scalding water. They proceeded to rub salt into her wounds. Shortly after this incident, the father of a neighborhood boy named Michael John Monroe anonymously called Arsenal School to report that a girl with open sores all over her body was living at the Banaszewski house. Since Sylvia had not attended school for several days, a school nurse visited Gertrude's address to investigate. Gertrude told the nurse that Sylvia had run away from home the previous week and that she did not know her whereabouts. She added that Sylvia was out of control and that her open sores were the result of her refusal to maintain personal hygiene. Gertrude also claimed that Sylvia was a bad influence on both her own children and her sister. The school did not conduct any further investigations into Sylvia's whereabouts or well-being. In mid-October, John Banaszewski Jr. cruelly tormented Sylvia by offering her a plate of soup and swiftly pulling it away as she tried to eat with her hands. By then, Sylvia was already suffering from extreme malnutrition. That day, Gertrude Banaszewski allowed Sylvia to sleep upstairs, but only on the condition that she did not wet the bed. At night, Sylvia quietly asked Jenny to give her a glass of water in secret before she went to sleep. The next morning, Gertrude discovered that the girl had peed herself. As punishment, she was once again forced to masturbate using a glass bottle in the presence of the Banaszewski children. Shortly thereafter, Gertrude shouted for Likens to return to the kitchen, then ordered her to strip naked before proclaiming to her, "You have branded my daughters. Now I am going to brand you." She began carving the words, "I'm a prostitute and proud of it," onto Likens's abdomen with a heated needle. When Gertrude was unable to complete the markings, she instructed one of the neighborhood kids, 14-year-old Richard Dean Hobbs, to finish etching the words into Likens's flesh as she took Jenny to a nearby grocery store, in what Hobbs would later insist were short, light etchings. He continued to brand the text into Likens's abdomen as she clenched her teeth and moaned. Richard, like 10-year-old Shirley, took Sylvia to the basement, where they each proceeded to use an anchor bolt in an attempt to burn the letter S beneath Likens' left breast, although they applied one section of the loop backwards, and this deep burn scar would resemble the number 3. On that grim night, after enduring terrible abuse, Sylvia told her sister Jenny, "I know you don't want me to die, but I'm going to die, I'm sure of it." The next day, Gertrude woke Sylvia and forced her to write a letter while dictating its contents. The plan was sinister. They intended to deceive the Likens' parents into believing that Sylvia had run away from the Banishevsky residence. The content of this letter was intended to frame a group of anonymous local boys for extensively abusing and mutilating Likens after she had initially agreed to engage in sexual relations with them before they inflicted the extreme abuse and torture upon her body. After Likens had written this letter, Gertrude finished formulating her plan to have John Jr. and Jenny blindfold Sylvia, then take her to a nearby wooded area known as Jimmy's Forest and leave her there to die. Sylvia was once again tied to the stair railing in the basement. Gertrude offered her cookies to eat, but Sylvia refused them, saying, "Give them to the dog, I don't want them." In response, Gertrude forcefully stuffed the cookies into Sylvia's mouth, and she and John began to beat her, focusing on her stomach. On the morning of October 26th, Sylvia was unable to speak intelligibly or coordinate her limb movements properly. Gertrude took her to the kitchen, leaned her against the wall, and tried to feed her a donut and a glass of milk, but Sylvia couldn't hold the glass properly. Frustrated, Gertrude threw Sylvia to the floor and then returned her to the basement. Soon after, Sylvia became delirious, moaning and muttering repeatedly. When Paula asked Sylvia to recite the English alphabet, Sylvia could not get past the first 4 letters or get up from the floor. That afternoon, several of the neighborhood tormentors gathered in the basement. Sylvia flailed her arms in an apparent attempt to point out the faces of the tormentors she recognized, shouting names like, "You're Ricky" and "You're Gertie." Minutes later, Sylvia tried unsuccessfully to bite into a rotten pear she was given, saying she couldn't feel her teeth. Hearing this, Jenny reminded her, "Don't you remember, Sylvia? Your front tooth fell out when you were 7 years old." Exhausted from all the abuse and certain she would die there, Sylvia desperately tried to escape the basement but collapsed without the strength to make it up the stairs. This attempt was met with the harshest of punishments. Gertrude struck Sylvia's head with excessive violence. Sylvia lost consciousness, and Gertrude just stood by, watching her for a while. Shortly after, at 5:30 p.m., Richard Hobbs returned to the Banishevsky residence and immediately went to the basement. He found Stephanie crying and embracing Sylvia's emaciated and lacerated body after their mother had ordered her to clean Sylvia's body. Stephanie and Richard then decided to give Sylvia a warm, soapy bath and dress her in clean clothes. They laid her on a mattress in one of the bedrooms. Sylvia murmured her last wish, hoping her father would be with her, or at least that she could be taken home. After enduring severe punishment and weakened from lack of food, Sylvia finally succumbed to her injuries and died. When Stephanie realized Sylvia wasn't breathing, she tried to perform mouth-to-mouth resuscitation, while Gertrude repeatedly screamed at the children in the house that Sylvia was faking her death. Initially, Gertrude hit Sylvia's body with a book, yelling at her that she was lying and pretending in an attempt to wake her. Soon, in a panic, Gertrude told Richard Hobbs to call the police from a nearby payphone. When the police arrived at their address around 6:30 p.m., Gertrude led the officers to the bedroom. She showed them Sylvia's extensively beaten and mutilated body lying on a dirty mattress. She then handed them the letter that Sylvia had been forced to write. Gertrude also claimed that she had been caring for the young girl for an hour or more before her death, after having applied antiseptic to Sylvia's wounds in a futile attempt at first aid. She told the police that Sylvia had run away from home with several teenagers before returning to her house that afternoon, bare-chested and with the note in her hands. Holding a Bible, Paula, having declared to everyone in the house that Sylvia's death was meant to happen, looked at Jenny and calmly said, "If you want to live with us, Jenny, we'll treat you like our own sister." Following instructions she had received before the police arrived, Jenny recited the rehearsed version of the events leading up to Sylvia's death, before whispering to the officers to take them away and that she would tell them everything. The formal statement provided by Jenny Likens led to the arrest of Gertrude, Paula, Stephanie, and John Jr. Baniszewski on suspicion of Sylvia's murder, just hours after her body was discovered. The same day, Coy Hubbard and Richard Hobbs were also arrested and charged with the same crimes. The three older Baniszewski children, along with Coy Hubbard, were placed in a nearby juvenile detention center. The younger Baniszewski children and Richard Hobbs were held at the Indianapolis Child Guardian's home. All were detained without bail pending trial. Initially, Gertrude denied any involvement in Sylvia Likens' death, though just a day into her detention, she confessed to knowing the children and acknowledged that her daughter Paula and Coy Hubbard had physically and emotionally abused Sylvia. Gertrude also admitted to forcing the girl to sleep in the basement on approximately 3 occasions when she had wet the bed. She became evasive when an officer suggested that the probable reasons for Sylvia's incontinence were her mental distress and kidney injuries. Paula, showing no remorse, signed a statement admitting she had repeatedly beaten Sylvia. She also confessed to an incident where Sylvia's wrist was fractured and admitted to other acts of brutality, such as pushing her down the basement stairs 2 or 3 times. John Jr. confessed to whipping Sylvia once and often used his fist to abuse her. He admitted to burning Sylvia with matches on several occasions and added that his mother had repeatedly burned the girl with cigarettes. The autopsy of Sylvia Likens' body revealed she had suffered over 150 separate injuries across her body and was extremely emaciated at the time of her death. The injuries varied in location, nature, severity, and healing stage. They included burns, severe bruises, and extensive damage to muscles and nerves. Her vaginal cavity was swollen and nearly closed, though an examination determined her hymen was still intact, debunking Gertrude's claims that Sylvia had been 3 months pregnant and the accusations of prostitution and promiscuity. The official cause of Sylvia Marie Likens' death was identified as subdural hematoma, resulting from a strong blow to the right side of her head. The shock she suffered, primarily due to severe and prolonged damage to her skin and subcutaneous tissue, as well as chronic malnutrition, were also noted by the doctor in relation to Sylvia's death. Rigor mortis had fully developed by the time her body was discovered, indicating that Sylvia could have been dead for up to 8 hours before she was found. Although the autopsy doctor noted that Sylvia had been bathed recently, possibly post-mortem, this action could have accelerated the loss of body temperature and therefore the onset of rigor mortis. Gertrude Baniszewski, her eldest daughter Paula, her son John, and two neighborhood youths, Coy Hubbard and Richard Hobbs, were tried and convicted in May 1966 for the neglect, torture, and murder of Sylvia Likens. After 8 hours of deliberation, the jury found Gertrude Banaszewski guilty of first-degree murder. She was sentenced to life imprisonment but was paroled in 1985. Paula was found guilty of second-degree murder and was released in 1972. Hobbs, Hubbard, and John were found guilty of manslaughter and spent less than 2 years in the Indiana Reformatory before being granted parole on February 27, 1968. The citizens of Indiana consider the torture and murder of Sylvia Likens the worst crime ever committed in their state, and a lead investigator from the Indiana Police Department has described it as the most sadistic case he investigated in his 35 years of service. Sylvia died on October 26 in Indianapolis, Indiana, USA. Her parents were supposed to return for her and her sister in November, but Sylvia passed away before their arrival. The Likens sisters were fearful of reporting the increasing incidents of abuse and neglect to family members or adults at their school, worried that doing so might worsen their already dire situation. Both sisters feared that speaking out would only worsen their situation. Jenny, the younger sister, struggled against the urge to inform family members because Gertrude had threatened that she would be abused and tortured just as her sister was if she spoke up. Jenny also faced harassment from neighborhood girls who ridiculed or occasionally beat her whenever she mentioned Sylvia's situation. The closest neighbors of the Banaszewski residence, a middle-aged couple, along with other families in the neighborhood, suspected or had seen signs that the girls were being mistreated, but no one dared to report it to the authorities. Nothing was done to stop the abuse the Likens sisters were enduring, and no one could rescue them in time from this nightmare. All those involved in her torture and murder were sentenced to prison. Although some of the culprits did not serve their full sentences, they could not escape the scars and the horror they caused, which will follow them for the rest of their lives. With this, we conclude today's episode of Unreal True Crime. Once again, I remind you to subscribe and leave a like to let me know you appreciate my work. Good night, and see you next time. In Kern County, there are many murders each year, but the murder of Yvette Pena in a Bakersfield motel caught the public's eye and became especially infamous. This tragic event occurred in 2011 and was shocking in its brutality. What made this case even more remarkable was the individual who confessed to the crime, a merciless man covered in tattoos. His chilling demeanor and the gruesome details of the murder captivated and horrified the community. Born on March 7, 1988, in Bakersfield, California, Jaime Osuna's early life unfolded in a tumultuous manner. His mother, Michelle, was just 19 years old at the time, while little is known about his father except that he was 21, rebellious, and undisciplined. Jaime's father displayed abusive tendencies toward Michelle from the start, even resorting to kicking her in the stomach while she was pregnant with Jaime. This cruel act left lasting harm on Jaime, even before he took his first breath. Some speculate that this incident may have contributed to Jaime's ear malformation and potentially impacted his brain development. Recognizing the abusive nature of her husband, Michelle made the courageous decision to divorce him. Soon afterward, she met Jeff, a man with whom she felt an instant connection, and it appeared that Jeff would step into the role of Jamie's new stepfather. Jamie's biological father, however, strongly opposed this development. Despite Michelle's desire to sever ties with him, he persisted in causing trouble. One fateful night, he threatened Jeff by holding a knife to his throat. Thankfully, the situation didn't escalate further. He was apprehended and a restraining order was issued. This marks the last mention of Jamie's biological father in his story. Shortly thereafter, Michelle married Jeff, and they began cohabiting with Jamie and his brother, who was 2 years Jamie's senior. This is where the story takes a dark and troubling turn. While Jeff desired Michelle, he seemed less enthusiastic about assuming the role of a stepfather. Regrettably, this resulted in a period of misery for Jaime, while his older brother was somewhat spared, having gone to live with their grandparents once they became aware of Jeff's abusive behavior. It remains unclear why Jamie wasn't also taken in by his grandparents, but it seems that they declined to care for him, leaving one to wonder why they would reject a 3-year-old child. It's important to note that Michelle also made the choice to prioritize her relationship with Jeff over the well-being of her 2 young sons. Jeff's abusive actions were well documented through accounts from Michelle, Jaime, and records from hospitals and law enforcement agencies. On one occasion, during a road trip with Michelle and Jaime secured in a baby carrier in the back seat, Jaime's crying provoked Jeff to a point where he began shouting at the child. Shockingly, he then threw the baby carrier out of the moving car. Fortunately, the baby carrier landed safely, and Jamie displayed no visible injuries. However, subsequent examinations revealed severe brain damage that could have resulted from this traumatic incident. Around the age of 5, another distressing incident marred Jamie's already tumultuous childhood. He accidentally spilled some juice on the floor, which infuriated Jeff. In a fit of anger, Jeff grabbed a belt and began to mercilessly beat the young boy. This time, Michelle intervened by calling the police. Jeff was subsequently arrested on charges of child cruelty due to the visible marks on Jamie's body. However, the charges were relatively lenient and, disconcertingly, Jeff returned home just 10 days later, with Michelle still standing by his side. Even after they had their own children, Jeff continued to mistreat Jamie, depriving him of proper meals and sometimes serving his food on the floor. Jaime increasingly felt like an outsider in his own home. Michelle, though aware of her past mistakes, found herself unable to rectify the deep-seated damage that had been done. At the age of 12, Jaime finally managed to escape the clutches of his abusive household and went to live with his grandparents. Everyone had come to realize that Jeff's mistreatment of Jamie would not cease. It was during this time that they began to notice the emotional numbness that had gripped Jaime from a tender age. Michelle described it as if his soul had been torn away, leaving him apathetic towards everything and everyone around him. This period marked the onset of Jaime's disturbing behavior. He began cooking animals in a nearby forest, and in the absence of anyone at home, subjected his own pet cat to chilling ordeals, locking it in the refrigerator and even the oven. He also turned to self-harm, as it seemed to be the only way for him to feel something, anything, in a world where he felt utterly numb. At the age of 15, Jaime took a dire turn when he brutally stabbed another boy, leaving him gravely wounded but fortunate to survive the ordeal. This criminal act led to Jaime's incarceration in a juvenile correctional facility, where he would spend the next 4 years. It was during this period that Michelle finally confronted the gravity of her irresponsibility toward Jaime, resulting in her decision to divorce Jeff. A few years later, Jeff met his demise due to a heart attack. Given his abusive history, it's conceivable that Jaime might have inflicted harm upon him if he had not passed away. On September 14, 2007, Jaime was released from prison at the age of 19. By this time, he had acquired a notorious reputation as a troublemaker, deeply entrenched in gang activities. He showed little interest in education or gainful employment, instead opting for a lifestyle characterized by revelry and association with his gang affiliates. The turning point in this harrowing narrative occurred in December 2008 when a 16-year-old boy's birthday party took a rather unexpected turn. This was no typical birthday celebration adorned with Mickey Mouse piñatas and cheerful decorations. Instead, it drew a crowd from the gritty underbelly of society, and the absence of any responsible adult to maintain order was notable. This unconventional gathering had been organized by the birthday boy's mother, who was known for her laissez-faire attitude. Joelle Castellano, a 37-year-old single mother of three, played a central role in this intriguing tale. She decided to host a party for underage youths, which, while undoubtedly irresponsible, didn't spell the end of the world. As the evening progressed, however, things took a turn for the chaotic, with Joelle's dance with a young man catching the eye of her nephew. It seemed that this young relative became envious, possibly due to his own romantic feelings for his aunt, leading him to want to keep others away from her. In his quest to intimidate the young man, Joelle pointed to Jaime, who, despite not yet having the distinctive facial tattoos he would later acquire, stood at around 5'3". However, it was Jaime's demeanor and attitude that made him an intimidating presence, perhaps more so than anyone else in the room. Jaime agreed to confront the young man, proceeding to the kitchen, where he retrieved a knife and warned the boy to steer clear of Joelle. The young man, believing that Jaime wouldn't actually follow through, issued a challenge. However, Jaime defied expectations and indeed stabbed the young man, leading to his return to prison. But something had changed this time. Jaime couldn't shake one thought from his mind. He had fallen head over heels in love with Joelle. It wasn't just because of the recent stabbing incident, but a genuine and profound love. As they say, love can compel us to commit acts beyond imagination. Jaime no longer cared about his circumstances. He believed he could win over Joelle, despite their age gap, his imprisonment, and their initial encounter involving a stabbing. Jaime began sending heartfelt love letters to Joelle, and eventually, she too succumbed to his affections. Thus, they embarked on a long-distance relationship. 11 months later, when Jamie completed his sentence, Joelle picked him up in her truck. However, her confidence wavered upon seeing that Jamie had acquired facial tattoos, raising doubts about the seriousness of their relationship. Despite all the waiting, Jamie's eagerness prevailed as he suggested to Joelle that they spend the night in a motel. Joelle agreed, albeit under the impression that it would be a one-night affair. Yet Jaime, known as the sharpshooter, proved remarkably effective, as that single night led to Joelle becoming pregnant. With this development, she felt increasingly inclined to establish a lasting relationship with him. A mere 3 months later, they sealed their commitment in marriage. Jaime made solemn promises to Joelle, assuring her that he understood the hardships of growing up in a fractured family and vowing to be a devoted father and husband. However, even before their child came into the picture, he exhibited abusive behavior towards Joelle. It's at this point in the story that he began to adopt characteristics reminiscent of the Joker, not to sensationalize the narrative, but because there is a noticeable parallel. His abuse towards Joelle wasn't solely physical. It had a strong psychological element, perhaps driven by the belief that this form of harm could be even more devastating. An example of this occurred during one heated argument when things spiraled out of control. Jaime seized the ashes of Joelle's deceased mother from a vase and fled with them. He was keenly aware that Joelle had not yet come to terms with her mother's passing, and this act prompted her to call the police. Jamie was arrested, but the ashes were never recovered. This unfortunate incident resulted in Jamie being sent back to prison, causing him to miss the birth of his child. Upon his release, Joel granted him another chance, hoping that, with the child's arrival, Jamie would take on the role of a responsible father. Unfortunately, this turned out to be a futile endeavor. Shortly thereafter, Jamie shifted his focus from physical harm to inflicting emotional distress on Joel. She did something that greatly disturbed individuals like him who craved attention. She ignored him completely. Regardless of what he said or did, it no longer affected her. One day, in an attempt to provoke a reaction from Joel, Jamie pushed her 7-year-old son off the bed, all while keeping his gaze fixed on her. His tactics proved successful. She became visibly upset and fetched a knife from the kitchen. In a stern tone, she warned him, "Mess with me, but never with my kids." At that moment, Jamie's face betrayed his surprise and fear. He hadn't anticipated such a response. Frightened, he reached out to his gang to extricate him from the situation. While outside the house, Jamie turned to methamphetamines, which explains his current aged appearance, making him resemble a 60-year-old man. Now that he no longer officially resided with Joel, he commenced stalking her from outside her home. Joel called the police, leading to Jamie's arrest and a 7-month prison sentence for violating his parole. However, within a week of his release, he resumed his harassment of Joel. She would spot him outside her window, his gaze unwavering, and he would make menacing phone calls, threatening her and her children. Joel contacted the police once again, but upon their arrival they failed to locate Jamie. Days passed with no trace of him. Then, on November 8, 2011, Joel received a chilling call from Jamie, in which he uttered the sinister words, "Check the news. I just killed a woman at the Morocco Motel." Naturally, Joel's immediate response was to contact the police. However, they didn't take her seriously. What transpired next is where the story takes an eerie turn, as it was 5 days after this call that a motel employee discovered a gruesome crime scene in one of the motel's rooms. The victim was a 37-year-old woman named Yvette, a mother of 6. Details are scarce, but it appears to have been an exceedingly horrific crime scene. Investigators, who deemed it one of the most disturbing cases in their careers, found evidence of 2 knives and scissors used in the slow and torturous manner of death. Jamie, it seemed, harbored a sadistic streak. You might wonder how I have access to these gruesome details. Well, this wouldn't be his solitary murder, nor the most heinous. Even more chilling is the absence of any apparent motive for targeting this woman, strongly suggesting that she became a victim solely because of her resemblance to Joel. Jamie would ultimately face arrest, trial, and sentencing for this horrifying murder. While incarcerated, Jamie took disturbing actions to further torment Joel. He would occasionally contact Child Protective Services in an attempt to have her custody of her children revoked, knowing that this would inflict the most pain on her. He even went to the extent of trying to hire a hitman to eliminate her. However, because he communicated these intentions through letters, the police intercepted them before they could reach their intended recipient. These actions only added layers to the mask he wore, a facade he maintained to feel something, a desperate attempt to fill the void he had experienced as a child. The trial for the murder of Yvette dragged on for 5 years, during which Jamie displayed no remorse whenever he appeared in court. He would even wave and laugh at the victim's family. This extended trial was a result of Jamie's refusal to confess. It's worth noting that he managed to prolong the trial for more than half a decade by remaining silent. However, on March 24, 2017, just 3 days before the final trial, where the verdict was still uncertain, a news channel offered him an interview. They aimed to capitalize on his striking appearance to generate clicks and had planned to ask him challenging questions to elicit a confession. To everyone's astonishment, They didn't need to ask any questions because Shamie confessed to the murder of Yvette right at the start of the interview. It's evident that he did this to gain notoriety, as there is no doubt that he deliberately presented himself as a villain in the news. What corroborates this is his confession to 2 more murders, one at the age of 13 and the other at 19. The police initiated a search for the supposed victims based on Jamie's descriptions, since he hadn't provided any names. Given that he had spent his entire life in Bakersfield, the margin for error was minimal. However, the database did not yield any records of missing persons or unsolved murders that could be attributed to him. Therefore, it's highly likely that these claims are exaggerated. With all these confessions, Shamie was undoubtedly found guilty 3 days later. However, he did not receive the death penalty because of his confession on the day of the trial, which had caused a 5-year delay and wasted time and resources. Still, what remains perplexing to everyone is what happened next. Upon entering prison, he exhibited increasingly erratic behavior. He painted the walls of his cell with his own blood. On one fateful evening, he was placed in a cell with a man he harbored animosity towards, and he mercilessly stabbed him multiple times using a knife. He even inflicted a deep facial wound, requiring the victim to undergo 67 stitches. Shamie went so far as to request photographs of his victims as trophies, further underscoring the disturbing nature of his actions. He had earned a reputation as an inmate too dangerous to share a cell with anyone, but in a bewildering and illogical turn of events in March 2019, Shamie found himself with his first-ever cellmate, a 44-year-old man named Luis Romero. In 1992, at the tender age of 17, Luis, originally from Guatemala, had joined a gang in the United States and had taken someone's life during a confrontation with rival gang members. He had been sentenced to 27 years in prison and was on the verge of completing his sentence. However, in a confounding and irrational twist of fate, he was assigned to the same cell as Shamie, who had committed a more gruesome crime. Shamie was well aware of the extent of his own actions, having just committed them, boasting a lengthy history of criminal deeds. Moreover, he had been denied cellmates in the past because of the perceived danger he posed. Luis was merely 3 weeks away from regaining his freedom. In less than 24 hours since they had become cellmates, on the morning of March 9, 2019, when correctional officers came to inspect their cell, they stumbled upon an eerie sight. Shamie was smiling, wearing a collar. This collar was fashioned from various parts of Luis's body, and Shamie had gone as far as carving a grotesque, clown-like smile on Luis's face. He had toyed with his lifeless body, inscribed messages on the walls using blood, and declared, "I am the man of 1,000 faces." Now, the theories start to surface because it is evident that such an atrocity would require more than a mere hour. It would take many hours to commit such unspeakable acts. A correctional officer responsible for conducting a nighttime check reported that everything was in order, even though Luis's body indicated that the gruesome assault had already begun at that hour. Some guards attempted to justify this oversight by claiming that Shamie had placed a blanket to conceal the ongoing horror. But if an inmate places a blanket to obscure events behind a cell door, it is incumbent upon the guard to enter and investigate. What transpired here was not an isolated incident at this prison. It occurred at a prison which had gained notoriety due to allegations of guards organizing fights among inmates, all while placing bets on the outcomes. There exist videos of these fights, complete with a presenter and commentator. Furthermore, suspicions linger that this practice was employed when authorities sought to dispose of a troublesome inmate. They would orchestrate a fight, and when one participant was winning, they would shoot the other inmate, claiming they were intervening to save them. This case presents further complexity due to Jamie's clearly deteriorated mental state. It is evident that he harbors a fascination with the Joker, as evidenced by the blood-written phrases from the comics adorning his cell. It remains a mystery how he managed to procure razors to make knives, and his letter to a prosecutor inspired by the Joker and featuring the iconic "Why so serious" phrase raises questions. The letter also contained satanic messages, although it's doubtful he genuinely adheres to Satanism. These actions are likely undertaken for attention-seeking purposes. He received a diagnosis of an unknown form of schizophrenia within the spectrum, alongside antisocial personality disorder, borderline personality disorder, characterized by erratic behavior, which could explain his propensity to stab others without a clear provocation, and post-traumatic stress disorder. As a result, authorities declared him unfit to stand trial. Consequently, at the age of 33, it appears improbable that Jaime will face the death penalty, and he will likely spend the rest of his life behind bars. Jaime was undeniably unhinged, with a touch of clownishness. However, some might argue that he endured a troubled childhood. Nevertheless, the extremity of his actions remains unparalleled. Interestingly, his older brother, who sought refuge with their grandparents at a young age, has since transformed into a prosperous individual, a millionaire who enjoys driving sports cars and has a loving family. You've just witnessed another unreal true crime. Lock in your support by subscribing and turning on notifications. Your insight could open the next story. Have a good day. It was November 2020 in a small town in Chile, and a 12-year-old girl named Melissa Chavez was sleeping peacefully. Melissa, known for her bright smile and strong spirit, had faced a lot of tough times in her life. That night, she finally fell asleep easily, feeling safe and comfortable in her bed. What she didn't know was that this night was different. It was quiet and calm, but something was not right. This would be her last night, and the quiet around her was hiding the sad truth that her days of playing and laughing were about to end. Melissa Chavez was born in 2008 in the city of Coquimbo, Chile. She was the youngest child of Mirta Ardil and Denny Chavez, who already had 3 children. Although Mirta and Denny were really nice people, the couple decided to separate shortly after Melissa's birth after 8 years together. However, Melissa's paternal family continued to stay in touch with her. Her aunt, Gina Chavez, had a special affection for her and was always concerned for her well-being. To support her household as a single mother, Mirta worked various jobs, including in a bar. It was there she became very close friends with Maria Teresa Caballero, a co-worker. Almost every night after closing the bar, Maria would head to another nearby bar to work extra hours and earn more money. Since Mirta often accompanied her wherever she went, she eventually found employment at that place as well. One night, while Mirta was working at the bar, a regular customer approached her. His name was Luis. Although details about his life are scarce, it is known he was born in 1981, worked in a mine in Antofagasta, and lived with his then partner. This first encounter led to a romance that neither Luis's ongoing relationship nor their age difference, with Mirta being 8 years his senior, could prevent. Eventually, Luis left his partner and moved in with Mirta. By the year 2010, when Melissa was just 2 years old. By this time, Melissa's reserved nature was already evident, a trait that did not change much as she grew older. When she started school, she was kind but clearly found it hard to socialize and had few friends. Her shyness extended towards Luis, whom she saw as a stranger. However, in 2012, when her mother and he welcomed their first child together, the new sibling helped Melissa to start accepting Luis into her life. From that point forward, he also took on a role in her upbringing, offering her affection and care as if she were his own daughter. In turn, she began to refer to him as her father. This dynamic continued for a while, allowing Melissa to experience something she had almost never had, a sense of a home without fractures. But in 2014, Luis's behavior towards her changed. Everything occurred one afternoon when he was looking after her while Mirta was at work. Just then, without warning, what had always been merely affectionate treatment turned into inappropriate touching. Melissa first confided in one of her older sisters and only afterward alerted her mother. Around the same time, the girl was seen by her school's psychologist, to whom she also revealed what had happened. Faced with the alarming disclosure and the need to act to protect the girl, the news was communicated to the school's principal. She reached out to Mirta, and knowing how serious the situation was, the psychologist and they went to talk to the authorities. A complaint was filed through the psychologist and the prosecutor's office. The prosecutor's office immediately opened a case, and as a result, the courts decided to revoke the mother's custody of her daughter. Initially, it was thought that temporary custody would be given to the biological father. However, at that time, his situation was far from ideal. On the contrary, he was suffering from deep depression and struggling with alcoholism. As such, Melissa was placed in the care of her Aunt Gina. As for Mirta, in October 2014, the same court referred her to a family court program. The goal was to subject her to psychological and psychiatric assessments. Last but not least, to regain custody of her daughter, she was required to separate from Luis. During the process, she assured the authorities that she had indeed left him. However, the reality was that she was still in contact with him secretly. After 17 months, in March 2016, following supposed new evaluations that concluded Mirta was capable of resuming personal care of her daughter, the Child Protection Agency of Coquimbo returned the custody to her. Once Melissa was back home with her, the woman also took Luis back. Not content with having the girl and the aggressor live under the same roof, Mirta went to the authorities to retract the complaints against him. Since then, the agencies closed the investigation and did not follow up on the case. Several years passed with no records of any irregular events. It's unknown whether they didn't occur or were hidden. Thus, when September 2020 arrived, Mirta and Luis moved with Melissa and her younger brother to a 2-story house. The idea was to rebuild their lives in a calmer environment. Melissa, who was 12 years old at the time, had started secondary school and was in the 7th grade. As her mother had noticed, she was becoming a more independent young lady, which was evident, for example, in her long stays alone in her room, almost always listening to music. Sleeping in was another thing she enjoyed. And while she occasionally complained that her mother was too strict and demanding, overall, Melissa seemed content in the new neighborhood. But just then, Luis sought to resume the inappropriate behavior towards her, which had been suspended after the whole ordeal caused by the initial complaint. This time, fully aware of what was happening, Mirta chose to pretend nothing was happening. She didn't even make a complaint to protect her daughter. Instead, she often felt really jealous because Luis paid more attention to Melissa. The morning of November 26, 2020 proceeded with complete normality as everyone prepared to leave the house. But before that, Luis entered the teenager's room and, unlike previous instances, completed the act in its entirety. After the abuse, he left Melissa lying on her bed, devoid of any desire to move, deeply sad and ashamed. Around 10:30 that morning, Luis and his son left the house and took a taxi they had ordered in advance through an app. The sequence was recorded by the area's security cameras. While they were going to a vaccination day at the Sun School in the city center, Mirta was losing the battle against her inner demons. Alone with her daughter at home, the woman took a knife from the kitchen and went upstairs to Melissa's bedroom. At that time, the girl had succumbed to sleep amidst tears and despair. Once in front of her, her mother attacked her, causing multiple injuries that left her agonizing. Then, Mirta sent text messages to her dentist to arrange an appointment. Afterward, she returned to Melissa's room and set fire to the lower part of the bed, where the young girl had already lost all signs of life. It was just after 11 a.m. when closed-circuit cameras recorded her leaving the home. After stopping at a store to withdraw money, Mirta took a taxi she had ordered and went to her dental appointment. Once again, her movements were captured by cameras. Barely 7 minutes after her departure, neighbors noticed smoke coming from the house and contacted emergency services. Meanwhile, Luis and his son, on their way back, saw the fire truck speeding past them. As they approached their home, Luis could see the firefighters struggling to control the flames engulfing his house. Shocked and incredulous, he called Mirta. She confirmed that she had left Melissa sleeping. Upon receiving this information, his distress was uncontrollable, so much so that he even tried to enter, but the authorities prevented him. Meanwhile, neighbors tried to offer support and calm him down. Once the team managed to partially control the fire, they identified that it had originated in one of the bedrooms. Upon entering, they found Melissa's lifeless body, which had not been completely consumed by the fire. Initially, rescuers suggested that smoke inhalation might have been the cause of her death. As for Mirta, she returned home, ready to pretend. Already notified of the tragedy, both she and Luis appeared devastated in front of the neighbors and the television cameras present. Unaware of the truth, Luis demanded justice, stating, "The person responsible, they're going to have to pay. They will have to pay for everything they did." Once Melissa's remains were transferred to the morgue, the investigation at the scene continued, and investigators collected some kitchen utensils and other items from the house for further analysis. Early findings led to the initial hypothesis of death by smoke inhalation being dismissed, and the possibility of third-party involvement began to gain traction. In the preliminary autopsy report, forensic experts noted that the body showed signs of blunt force trauma and puncture wounds. While the prosecutor requested to wait for the final results, the information somehow leaked, and soon, neighbors took to the streets demanding justice for Melissa and expressing their fear of a criminal loose in the area. After the forensic analyses were completed, and while waiting for the detailed and definitive report, Melissa's body was released to her family for the wake and subsequent burial. At the funeral, Mirta urged anyone with relevant information to cooperate in the search for the truth and clarification of the case. Visibly affected, Luis did the same. However, suspicions were directed at the victim's mother, especially considering she had been the last to leave the house on that fateful day. Others claimed to have seen an older man leaving just before the smoke was noticed. This last theory was convenient for Mirta, who clung to it. However, upon reviewing the security cameras around the house, investigators found no evidence of the alleged presence of this individual. Therefore, they decided to pause this line of inquiry while continuing to search for new clues. Meanwhile, since their involvement could not be entirely ruled out, Luis and Mirta were summoned as suspects. On that occasion, both repeated their version of events. Additionally, their cell phones were made available to the authorities. Shortly after, the autopsy results confirmed the severity of the attack Melissa suffered, which, according to forensic doctors, would not have been fatal had she received timely medical help. The detectives in charge of the case revealed chilling details, confirming she suffered cranioencephalic trauma and had 11 sharp force injuries. The worst part was that they estimated she had agonized for approximately an hour. Recent sexual abuse was also indicated by injuries, but no genetic material could be retrieved. From that moment, Luis became a focus for the prosecutor, who could not ignore the 2014 precedent. Meanwhile, chemical tests performed on the seized utensils found traces of the victim's and her mother's DNA, particularly on the knife used in the attack. The prosecutor's office revealed crucial details about this evidence. The knife used in the attack had a distinctive tip damage, matching the injuries and fractures on the teenager's skull. Moreover, it wasn't just that the mother's and daughter's DNA was found, but where it was located. According to the Legal Medical Service, Melissa's genetic material was on the blade, and a significant genetic fingerprint of Mirta was on the handle. Chemical tests also showed that after being used as a weapon, it was washed to remove blood traces. With all this evidence supporting a case beyond reasonable doubt, on February 2, 2021, Mirta was arrested as the alleged perpetrator of the crime. Later, the police provided details including their knowledge of the events. At the formalization hearing, the public prosecutor charged Mirta with the crime of homicide. After presenting a video that evidenced the chronology of the event, the prosecutor pointed out the absence of eyewitnesses, the mother's attempt to erase all evidence, and the short span between her departure and the smoke sighting. In summary, for the public prosecutor, it was a passionate and ferocious crime. Although the defense insisted on her innocence, the prosecutor dismissed the idea outright. During the investigation, Mirta was held in preventive detention for 6 months. However, the public prosecutor's office still needed to investigate the nature of the relationship between Luis and the minor. Aware of his precarious situation, Luis fled. Despite authorities' efforts to locate him, neither relatives nor friends had any information about his whereabouts. In parallel, a multitude of neighbors and family members expressed their condemnation of Mirta, demanding justice for Melissa, while the house became a symbol of commemoration and protest. Mirta's defense attorney challenged the decision to keep her detained during the investigation period, but on February 10th, the Court of Appeals confirmed the preventive detention measure against Mirta. One of the most affected was obviously Gina Melissa's paternal aunt. Amid her grief, she criticized the failures of a system that, in her opinion, did not adequately follow up with the family or verify that the mother was qualified to regain custody. She was particularly outraged that the authorities had not ensured Mirta and Luis's separation. Eventually, the various efforts to locate Luis yielded results on Wednesday, November 17, 2021, when he was discovered in the upper area of Coquimbo. He was handed over to justice, facing charges for repeated abuses of a minor. The next day, the defendant was made available to the Court of Guarantees. During the hearing, the prosecution presented further details of the crimes he had committed against Melissa. After hearing the arguments of the prosecution, ordered preventive detention for Luis and his admission to jail, arguing that releasing him posed a danger to society. Meanwhile, on November 29th, the prosecution formally charged Mirta and added a new charge for being an accomplice to the sexual crimes committed by her partner against her daughter. Nearly a year later, on September 23, 2022, the investigation's closing hearing took place. That day, the arguments of the parties to justify continuing the trial highlighted the testimonies of fellow inmates from the penitentiary where Mirta was held in preventive detention. They pointed out that Myrta dedicated all her time to taking care of her appearance and never showed remorse or sadness for how she had acted against her own daughter. They also presented a psychological profile of the accused, indicating to the court that she did not understand empathy but was very familiar with manipulation, as she had provided details and information from the beginning to distort her actions and divert suspicions that arose around her. They stated that Myrta was a person with a preserved reality judgment, aware of the illegality of her acts and the consequences of her actions. This made her culpable as she presented a personality disorder but no loss of contact with reality. Awaiting trial, the regional prosecutor announced he would request life imprisonment for Myrta. For Luis, he would seek a sentence of more than 20 years in prison. On January 21, 2023, just before the trial began, Myrta was urgently transferred from jail to the hospital due to complications from kidney stones. Her hospitalization became public through a photo leaked on social media, prompting criticism from the defense team for the lack of privacy for their client. 3 days after a successful operation, she was discharged and returned to prison. Given the extreme gravity of the events and the fact that they involved a minor, the Child Rights Defense Office requested that the hearings be conducted without media presence. During the last preparatory hearing for the trial, the defense attorney focused on the absence of genetic material to dismiss the accusations against Luis. Ultimately, considering the evidence presented by the public prosecutor's office insufficient, the court dismissed the charges, and instead of preventive detention, Luis was placed under house arrest with a prohibition on leaving the country. Despite this decision, he still had to face a trial. Myrta was not as fortunate. Despite her lawyer's efforts, the highest judicial authority determined she should remain in preventive detention. The trial for Melissa's case took place on April 23, 2023. Presenting a detailed chronology of the events leading to the tragic outcome, the prosecutor asserted that all evidence pointed unequivocally to Myrta, a woman whose jealousy led her to see a rival in her own daughter. To support her case, security camera footage was exhibited in court. The defense criticized what they considered a lack of thoroughness in the investigation, arguing that other leads that could have led to the real culprit and not Myrta were not sufficiently explored. The defense attorneys requested that the court consider their client's substantial cooperation since the beginning of the investigation, initially as witnesses and later as defendants. They proposed a sentence of 10 years for homicide and 5 for arson for Myrta, and a 3-year and 1-day prison sentence for Luis. However, both the public prosecutor and the case advocates opposed all the requests. On May 17, 2023, in a unanimous decision, the court found Luis and Myrta guilty of the charged crimes. Following the verdict, the prosecutors thanked the support of civil society and the entities involved in the investigation, including the experts from the forensic laboratory. On May 27, 2023, the court sentenced Myrta to 33 years in prison, 18 for homicide, and 15 for being the author of a consummated arson. Luis Santander was sentenced to 10 years and 1 day for repeated sexual abuse of Melissa Chavez and was prohibited from engaging in activities involving minors. The case deeply shocked Chilean society, and though the sentences could not reverse the irreparable loss of Melissa and the life she could have had, they brought some consolation to the community with the effective action of the judiciary. Dear viewers, this concludes today's story. Remember to subscribe and leave a like to let me know you appreciate my work. Good night.